All right, everybody, welcome back for another episode of 2 Feet Deep. We want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. We also want to give a special thank you to silvermansound.com for the royalty-free music that you hear in the episode today. Slide on over to silvermansound.com if you're interested in experiencing some royalty-free music. We hope you enjoy today's episode. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another awesome week of 2 Feet Deep. And I'm Derek here with my co-host Eddie Bromley. How you doing today, brother?
And I am so excited. In fact, I brought a bunch of things to do to keep me busy during this podcast. I thought I would do some paper shredding, tax returns from last year. Just thought I'd do that while we're talking. Probably going to fix an
Yeah.
omelet.
Anything you can do to create anything you can do to create background noise would be great.
Right. Man, I'm doing great,
Because there's
Derek.
nothing more fun. There's nothing more fun than having to go back and try to edit out all of the noise that you and I create.
That's exactly. Yeah, I'm having a great morning, man. I'm excited to get started. What do we have?
All right. Well, I think both of our listeners know how our segments work, so we're going to jump right in without too much explanation to entertainment exegesis, where we're going to take a deep dive into an entertainment aspect. And so today, look, man, this is crazy. I came across this HBO documentary. It's a miniseries documentary. I think it takes place over the course of about 5 episodes, and it's called Last Stop Laramah. And I could be pronouncing the name of the town wrong, but I believe that's pretty close. Last Stop Laramah, and it's a town in Australia that's out in the absolute middle of nowhere, and it's got 11 people in it, and someone goes missing. And so everybody in the town is a suspect. I'm going to read you an excerpt from RogerEbert.com. It gives a little explanation. It says, Last Stop Laramie is a funny little documentary set in the Australian outback in a tiny town with a population of 11 people. The film first gives a picture of a group of wisecracking citizens, mostly elderly, who call this middle of nowhere place home. They share stories of late night revelries at the local watering hole, which is the only bar in town, and proudly point to the lack of police station, but the presence of a pet crocodile. The rusty bush landscape soaked in the orange sun makes Laramie feel like an ideal retirement spot. But, as is always the case, there is trouble in paradise. Of course, the trouble in paradise is there's this guy named Patty who looks like a fun-loving guy, and he goes missing. But then, as it looks like from the preview and the stuff that I've read, that maybe he wasn't just this great fun-loving guy after all. Everybody in the town kind of seems to literally hate each other. There's no cell service. There's one pub. There's a pet alligator, and like I said, everybody there is a suspect. And it sounds like, I mean, it's terrible because it's true. Somebody's gone missing, but they don't have police. They don't obviously like the government. Um, so from that perspective, it's terrible. It's a serious thing, but there's also a sense of hilarity to the whole idea that this place could even exist.
It sounds like an Agatha Christie novel being lived out in reality, right? I mean, so
Oh, that's perfect. That's isn't she the author of Murder on the Orient Express or whatever?
yes, and all what all of her books have in common is somehow they round up all the suspects and get them to go on a train ride together or get them to have a sleepover or something, and the detective, no one's leaving till we find the person that killed Mr. Mustard, and and of course, sometimes somebody gets knocked off in the middle of the night, but basically they just work through all the suspects until they find the murderer, which I think it's interesting because right, everybody, all the suspects are right there together, 11 of them, and there's nobody else in the whole town. Wow.
There's nobody even to solve the mystery in the town other than themselves, which seems like a horrible idea.
Sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it sounds absolutely bananas.
Like a cauldron for and just a pressure cooker to create suspicion and hatred and backbiting, which it sounds like was already there.
Right, yeah, yeah. So yes, if anything, this is not going to improve the relationships of the town. Um, I'm interested in actually kind of watching this to see, what happens. I don't know that anything gets solved through HBO coming in and doing a documentary. It is an interesting little thing, it's an interesting story, and I do hope they figure out what happened with Patty because he is a human being, and there's natural concern there. That's it. I don't, I know nothing else about it other than it sounds like a crazy premise. It sounds like an Agatha Christie story, like you said.
Yeah, it's a perfect social experiment, right? Because it's funny to think about what an act of violence does in a community. What happens when you know something goes wrong and you don't know exactly why it went wrong or how it went wrong. But to then boil it down to just this tiny community where you can watch all of those reactions happening in real time in a microcosm, and obviously they're all going to be much much closer to the situation. If something happens in my community, I live in a community with a greater population of upward of 1 million people, and of course we're all still concerned if something sad or bad or tragic happens to someone, but the pressure, unless it's someone you knew closely, that you're not going to feel that kind of pressure like you would um, if you live in a town of 11. Obviously, their population dropped by almost 10% with one guy going missing, right? So,
Oh, I know. Yeah, yeah. Well, and his poor dog went missing with him. So you know and when you watch the preview, which we'll put a link to the preview down in the show notes, but when you watch that preview, they even talk about, well, maybe they got fed to the alligator because the alligator is somebody's pet in the town. Of course, nobody likes anybody. Somebody actually in the preview literally mentions, well, this incident with Patty's been it's been planned for a long time. I'm like, what?
well, so I have two real pressing questions. So, does that population of 11, is that including the dog or excluding the dog?
Well, the population of 11 is including Patty, who is the person who goes missing. So it's actually a population of 10. What this does remind me of is 1 Peter 4:8. And 1 Peter 4:8 says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. And when you get into small groups that are around each other all the time, there does tend to be a love for each other, but there tends to be a time of being so close that you're easily frustrated with each other. You easily can point out everything that's wrong with another person. You can let those things well up in you, and you can become bitter, angry, jealous, all those things. And I guess those aren't necessarily just staples of smaller, tight knit communities that can be across the board in relationships in general. But I do think, it's always good to be reminded of, love is actually something that allows us to be in a place of patience with one another, a place of forgiveness with one another, a place of hope that whatever hurts people have caused, maybe that we won't have to experience them further as we move forward together. So, as I listened to the story, I was like, man, it's a funny story, but also it hurts me to think of a town of 11 people that just are all in each other's crawl all the time, frustrated and hate each other. And I think, man, there's nothing more powerful than love, and it sounds like this town could use a good dose of it, as well as many of us in our circles in our everyday life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. God forbid that we would have such trying circumstances to push us towards our need for love. But man, absolutely. Gosh.
Well, man, let's move on. We're going to take a look at what the what,
What the what? What
or
the what?
yeah,
What?
as people have said in the
What?
past, what the what. I have a feeling this segment's about to be renamed to what the what.
No, I like it the other way around. That's uh, if this show has a long history, uh, what the audience will discover is I'm very terrible at calling things the wrong thing. Even things I name, I'll call them something else. And
Right. I just
so,
think your poor kids.
yeah, yeah, Tony, Shelby, and Michael, uh,
Right. Which
none
is
of which are my kids' names.
hilarious because you don't even have three kids.
Yeah. I was thinking about adopting one,
Right,
but
right, right. Our what the what segment today is the idea of wealth. And I think it's a pretty common conception that money is the root of all evil. Have you heard such a claim?
yep. I've heard that lots and lots of times, quoted by religious and non-religious people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that a
You can
bunch.
even find it probably from the pulpit in sermons, and people will reference a scripture of the Bible that can, if not read correctly, seem to allude to this very idea. So I'm going to read that passage. The passage is First Timothy 6, uh, verse 10. Says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Doesn't that pretty much sum it up? Then that must mean the money's the root of all evil, right? Except that's not exactly what the verse said. And as you pointed out last week in our last show, context matters. And anytime that you take a verse out by itself, and you even focus on only part of the verse, because I only read a part of the verse, which is the part of the verse that most frequently gets quoted, we lose a little bit of the bigger picture. Now, I'm not giving the whole picture here. I'm only reading one verse before it and one verse after it, and that just that little bit of framework around it opens up the idea of what verse 10 is actually talking about. So I'm going to read verses 9 through 11 in First Timothy chapter 6 now. It says, "Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness." It's funny how just the verse before and the verse after can bring into perspective the very verse that can confuse us as far as what's going on here. And it's really not money in and of itself that is evil. Money is an inanimate object, no more or less than the table and chair that I sit at is evil. There's nothing inherently evil about money. However, there is an evil in anything that we begin to prioritize above God, above things that are righteous, above things that are holy. And ultimately, what the scripture points us to is that the love of money, the desire for that which you put a desire above that which is holy, can be a cause and root of all sorts of different kinds of evil, as your focus will begin to shift off of what is holy and what is good, or even what is healthy. You begin to become selfish. You begin to become greedy. You can become easily angered. You can become easily jealous when your focus is on money and what others have that you don't. All things that are harmful to the soul rather than healthy. And ultimately, I think that's where this passage in part leads us is to this focus that um, that money in and of itself is not evil. It's certainly necessary for us to live. There's nothing wrong with being rich. There's nothing wrong with being poor. It's about priorities in the end. What do you want to add to that?
Well, so the context, of course, is this part of the letter Paul is addressing Timothy, and Timothy is going to be a full time, already as a full time
Right.
worker in the gospel. So, missionary, he's a pastor. And I think and I don't say this to make us sound more heroic or more virtuous than maybe other professions or other callings, but what would be important for anyone listening to this podcast to know is that the vast majority of clergy who have ever lived, the vast majority were either in poverty or just hovering right above poverty. I think you turn on the television, see some of these megachurch pastors, and they have private jets and their Louis Vuitton
Mhm.
clothing and Armani suits and that kind of thing, and it sort of distorts what the actual lived reality is of most clergy. And
Right.
so, definitely here in the first century, um, Timothy is going to probably live with a lot of insecurity. He's going to give up a lot of things in order to serve in the ministry. And from time to time, when he's wondering how he's going to get his next meal or how he's going to make ends meet, or even maybe how he's going to do some of the tasks of ministry, he may be thinking to himself, man, if I had a patron to give me some money, or if I could find a way to turn a little bit I have into some real wealth, boy, could I do some real good. And probably that's true. And yet, it's a slippery slope to begin thinking that way, right? Because the if it like all desperately poor people, that there's just it can start becoming almost like a fever as you just dream and start just being eaten up with this idea of, boy, it'd be great if I could become rich, and something can really begin to distort in our hearts when that becomes almost our every waking moment's thinking. We begin to be consumed with that, and it starts becoming something dark within us. And it's like you said, it's not that being wealthy is a bad thing, or certainly we're not saying alleviating poverty is a bad thing. In fact, I think one of the reasons that money may consume the thoughts of poor people so much is just because they are always living, one anything away from disaster. One large utility bill, an automobile accident, one medical trip to the ER, and and they may be completely ruined. And when you're living that way, it's hard not to be thinking about money all of the time.
Absolutely.
And yet Paul still says, he still says, I understand. Paul himself would have been living very much, in the same way that Timothy was living, and in fact, Paul says in another one of his writings, "I've known what it is to have plenty, and
Know what
I've
it is
known
to
what it
have
is to
nothing.
have nothing. I've known what it is to be full, and I know what it is to be hungry." And another passage that gets taken out of context all the time, but what he says next is, I can endure, I can handle all things through Christ who gives me
Right.
strength.
Yeah. Right. Ultimately, I think that that those two um, perspectives that we just said. I mean, you really honed in on the specific to Timothy, as that letter obviously is, and where I kind of gave it a broader variety for all of us, and ultimately that lands in the same place, um, where you know there's a reason that this whole thing's called faith and trust, and we put that faith and trust in God above all else. Whether times are thin, or whether times are thick, whether times are in the valley, or whether times are on the mountain. And that, anybody who's lived a minute in this life has experienced both of those, regardless of whether it's financial or not. Um, I've certainly had my up and down moments. I know you've had your up and down moments. I know that our life, growing up, we talked in the first episode how you lived in a very poor community because you yourself were very poor, and I'm sure money was talked about much. I've had struggles in my life where I wondered how the bills were going to get paid myself. I don't know any minister because you talked about, I'm saying this because you talked about the mega church ministers that present very much a false perspective of what most people in ministry experience. I don't know any that don't live paycheck to paycheck.
I don't either. And I've known. I don't know, probably over 1,000 pastors in the last 30 years. I don't think I knew one of them that didn't have some financial struggles. And again, that's not to congratulate ourselves or pat
Oh,
ourselves
no.
on the back. There's a there's a lot of people that they go into areas that they feel called to, and I mean social workers. I mean, God bless social
And
workers.
teachers. Oh my
I
gosh.
mean, such teachers. I mean, yeah. People can say, "Oh, well, they get summers and off and all that." Yeah, and what they're doing during most of those summers is hustling, doing yard work for people or delivering pizzas or something. Most of the teachers I've known through the years during summer breaks, they're picking up some kind of side job because otherwise they're going to get to the end of the year. They're going to run out of money before they run out of calendar.
Yep.
So
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that I was mentioning it for anything other than for the perspective that I think this is how most people live. I really do. I think most people in our nation, for sure, are living that paycheck to paycheck, and it doesn't seem to matter. There's so many different professions that we have, and we all are, doing the best we can to make sure that we keep food on the table and roof over our head, so to speak. All right, are you ready, my brother, for the next segment
and
that we love to call the His Name News Game?
yay!
This is my week to stump Eddie. His name this game.
All
This is a
right.
fun little segment where we take time to try to stump each other with some silly, off the wall news article. We do not take this segment seriously by any perspective. So far, our attempts to connect the last two articles to scripture have been okay at best, atrocious at worst.
that's gen- that's generous. Okay, at
Okay
best.
at best. But it is fun. We have a good time doing it. We hope that it begins to bring you guys some laughter. Now, before I tell you what this article is about, I do want to remind you that last week I did tell you this is something where a problem is now been solved that mankind has struggled with for years all over the whole world. Are you
Wow.
ready?
Okay, so my life is going to be
Oh,
changed.
it
Yep,
is. It is.
I am ready.
Okay, here it goes. There has been a cure. And I know that sounds good because a
Cure.
cure is always good. For a cure for garlic bread. Are you ready? A group of researchers from the Ohio State University have found that one particular ingredient prevents that deliciously stinky scent of garlic from escaping into the air, and that its properties might eventually be able to fight back against dreaded garlic bread once and for all. And are you ready? Drum roll, please. What is it? It is whole milk plain yogurt. I don't know if you're following up your garlic bread with some whole milk plain yogurt, but if not, you are a fool because this is the answer. After some experimentation, a protein complex composed of whey and casein, a protein found in milk, performed the best out of the isolated protein experiments, and a higher concentration of butter fat was found to help during the fat only experiments. Greek yogurt, in theory, would work even better since it's higher in protein. And the fruit add ins, folks, they didn't seem to have an effect, positive or negative. So make no concerns. If you want it, it doesn't have to be plain. There you go, Ed.
Wow. Wow. You don't mean it. Oh, wow. Okay, so a portion of the scripture that I don't turn to a lot. I mean, I've read it, but I don't do a lot with it. But man, there seems to be, um, there seems to be some good stuff here.
Well, I mean, clearly we
Um,
found a cure in something. So
so
for starters, that is
we have found
extremely important.
Well, I think about what it's going to do for romance, and so I'm turning to the book Song of Solomon, and and if you've never read the Song of Solomon, the Song of Solomon is this back and forth poetry between a man and a woman who are courting. Maybe they're engaged, they're about to get married, they're in love, they're infatuated with one another, and so here is just one example, Song of Songs. And this is the woman singing to the man. She says, "Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfumes. No wonder the young women love you." And I just I picture this, instead of this Brad Pitt looking guy coming in. I picture, I don't know, somebody's built about like me coming in. He's eating about four pizzas, and she's saying this to him, but she doesn't really mean it. What she's really saying is, what she's what she's really saying is, you need some whole fat plain Greek yogurt. So where, fragrance, and Song of Solomon's a very sensual book. The ancient rabbis would not permit anyone under a certain age to even read it. You certainly weren't going to read it as a kid. It was one of the forbidden books of the Bible. Not really. They knew there was some hot stuff
Oh
in
yeah,
there.
right. One of my
Uh,
favorites, and I've definitely told this to my wife because I think that any woman would love to know that their nose is as lovely as the Tower of Lebanon. It stands guard in Damascus.
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, look. I mean that's what your wife's been waiting to hear forever.
Well, I
That and her
mean,
teeth are like a beep.
well, when I'd asked her to marry me, she was on the fence. When I said, "Well, what if I told you that you have a nose that looks like a Tower of Lebanon?" And at that moment, it changed her total attitude towards marrying me, and she has loved me deeply ever since.
Um, Out of context, because I think it's the only way to do this. His name news game, Isaiah 3:24. Instead of a fragrance, there is now a stench. There you go.
Not anymore, brother, because we have a cure. And I'm
Yeah,
just thinking to
we're on.
myself, what possesses a group of scientists to try to cure something that ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, does nothing? I mean, maybe it does help some
Look.
romances. I don't know. But if your romance is built on how good your breath smells, I don't feel like that's going to last very long.
Yeah. Well, I can see, I can see this group of scientists. Look, it's obviously, it's very much for the benefit of humanity, right? They're thinking, okay, Joe's group's working on Alzheimer's, Susan's group's working on ALS research, such and such working on climate crisis. You know what we need to work? You know what niche we need? we're gonna we're gonna
We're
solve the
going to solve,
garlic problem.
we're going to solve the greatest one
Yeah.
of them all, garlic breath, folks.
Those those losers, they're over there trying to keep the polar bears from going extinct. We'll show them, you know.
Yeah. Oh, man. Always a fun segment, no doubt. It's always something silly that's
Yeah.
coming out of these, which I honestly think every week they keep getting better and better. I'm going to be real honest. I didn't see songs coming in uh, um, to the discussion really at any point in
Was that?
anything that we're doing.
It's such a sensual book, and taste and touch and fragrance. And, I mean, it's garlic, right? So,
Oh, me. That's
oh,
hilarious. Well, let's move on to our AI segment where we usually try to find
ooh,
any kind of tech that we talk about. It does not have to be
yeah.
tech that's coming up, but technology in general. I think we call this eschatological that big fancy word that means something to do with things to come.
It's get
eschatological. So
that's right.
today we're going to talk about, wait for it, clocks. Yes, we're going to talk about clocks.
Eschatological means end. The end of the series, right? The end of time or the end of the age. So yeah, clocks. Yeah, okay, all right, I'm tracking.
Okay, all right. So, the concept that I'm approaching this from is this idea of, are we as slaves to time? How long have we been a slave to time, if we are in history? And is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Will we continue to be a slave to time going forward? Or will we decide that time ultimately doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things? And so I thought I'd give us a little bit of history on the clocks. The clocks are not super new technology. We've been using some basis of calculated time with like sundials back to as early as the 1500 BC. Water clocks were something that were first looked at around like 900, and then again in the 1100s BC. An hourglass has been around for over 1,000 years. The mechanical clock came around 1300 in Europe. Um, Interestingly enough, even the United States didn't really have a standard time until trains became important. And that was officially, I guess we officially decided time was going to be, there would be a standard of time, November 8th, 1883, which I kind of find interesting. Obviously, the calendar had existed long before that. But as far as the time, when we're speaking time, I'm speaking time of day, hours, minutes, that kind of a thing. In the Middle Ages, people calculated time by how long it took to do something. So if you were going to meet with somebody, there wasn't a real, you couldn't say we're going to meet at 3 o'clock, because there was no such thing as 3 o'clock. There would be time was kind of based off of how long it took you to do something like prayer, or how long it took to milk the cows, or how long it took to harvest a field. This reminds me when my kids were younger. I think we may have even started this with my oldest, who is now 19, but I most recently remember it with my daughter, who is now 11. When she was young, she had no concept of time. So for young kids, this is kind of the reality they live by. The only concept of time is how long it takes them to do something they're familiar with. Well, she loved Mickey Mouse when she was young, and she used to watch the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, and it would take about 20 minutes to watch an episode of that. So when we would go to Granddaddy's, who lived 2 hours away, and she'd ask how much longer, we'd give her a reference point by saying, oh, it's about two Mickeys. We could say, oh, it's about 30 or 40 minutes, but she'd have no concept of that. And so we'd have to say, well, it takes about two Mickeys, as long as it would take you to watch two Mickey Mouse Clubhouse episodes. That's about how long. And that worked for her. It was this, she had something that was familiar to her to grab onto. So from that perspective, I can see how, that time framing would have worked, but it's still not the same as, hey, I got to catch a train at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. How are you going to do that if you didn't have any concept of when 1 o'clock in the afternoon was? There was no 9 to 5. It took you however long it took you to do whatever you needed to do. If it was, hey, I'll meet you after I get done at work, and work was plowing a field, then there was no 5 o'clock, and you get off at 5. It was however much field you had to plow that day, and however long it could be 7 o'clock, which you wouldn't know because there was no o'clock back then. Or it could be you were done, at lunchtime, because it just was determined on how long it took you to finish. That to me is fascinating, and how much freedom in that. So there's this a quote from Johnny Thompson from Big Think on an article he wrote called "How Humanity Became Slaves to the Clock." It says the first major corporation to use clocks regularly was the British Postal Service, followed by train companies. And that makes sense to me because those are two things that need to be timely, especially again, I've already referenced that train. So the question is, Eddie, I mean, like, from one perspective, you can see how there would be a lot of freedom in not being grounded by a clock continually. we all wear one on our wrists pretty much, or we walk around with one in our pocket because we constantly are looking at what time it is. So there'd be a lot of freedom to not have to do that. But at the same time, we live in a society where I think it would be almost impossible not to have one because we have so many meetings that we attend. We have so many times that we get together with friends, loved ones, and we try to do that at a specific time. In my family, we're already talking about what time we're going to eat Thanksgiving dinner, so everybody knows what time to be there. Um, what are your thoughts as far as, looking from the past? Has it been better for us to be a slave to time, or are we losing some of our freedom? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? How do you see it moving forward? What are your thoughts?
Well, so I think that it is obviously like with all technologies, it's been a good thing and a bad thing. So when you talked about the postal service being the first people to really start working with standardized time, the postal service was the first non-military organization that would literally have tens of thousands of moving parts and be operating to pull a very complex set of things off every single day. Obviously, if you cannot move tens of thousands of moving parts without a great deal of organization. The whole thing can't be built on, okay, when you get finished with supper and plowing the field, make sure you get your package to the next person over. I mean, the system could have obviously never work if it operated that way. It would just never be able to happen. Same thing with the train. You think the way the train system works is there's only so many sets of tracks everywhere, and actually multiple trains use each of those sets uh, every single day. So obviously,
Right.
you don't want to have a guess about when two particular trains are going to be crossing the same intersection. I mean, you're not leaving that to chance, right? I mean, there's just obviously, if you're not leaving to chance a train going south using the same tunnel as a train going north using that tunnel, and they're both going to be using it that day. You can't guess as to when that's going to happen. You've got to know precisely when that's going to happen. Same thing with moving, you know, people and goods and so forth. You can't sort of be guessing at that, or a 1 day trip will become a 4 month trip as you wait to pick up passengers who may finish plowing the field at who knows what time. And so obviously you see how these amazing modern innovations make it necessary for us to start thinking about time in a very, very different way. It's got to be very controlled. But the problem is that the very controlled use of time begins to also feel controlling, right? So that I worked somewhere before I was in ministry that would literally time your bathroom breaks.
Mm.
They knew what you were allowed. They knew what you were allowed to have legally, and they considered every minute money either in their pocket or out of their pocket, and so they literally timed your bathroom breaks. And honestly, I always thought that was rather a dehumanizing kind of thing.
I've actually
Um,
worked at a company too
because,
that didn't necessarily time them, but noted how many times you were using the restroom. And to
right,
an extent, somewhat how long you were in there, but more focused on how many trips you made. I always thought it was absolutely
yeah,
crazy. If you got to go to the bathroom, you got to go to the bathroom.
right. Um, and a human being is not a cog in a machine. And now, granted, I understand if you've got a employee that is making every excuse not to work and not to be productive. I understand that's a very easy thing to have and a hard problem to correct. At the same time, human being is not a cog in a machine, and things like bodily functions and things are um, you cannot perfectly, or at least most people cannot perfectly time when those things happen or how long it takes for those things to happen. And when we begin to atomize time like that, we begin to really start to think of people and experiences as being like commodities, right? We start treating them that way. I've heard lots of parents who are overstretched for time say, well, we focus on quality time, not quantity time. And, and I think there's a partial truth that you can have. You can focus on quality over quantity, but also part of what makes time quality is when you're lost in the moment with your child or your spouse and you're not thinking about the very next thing you've got to get to. Uh, and we've all been the person, we've been on both ends of it, right? To be with somebody and you know that they're eager to get on to their next thing and they're not fully present with you, right?
Right.
We've done that to other people. We've had that done to us, and it's not a real pleasant thing. And you don't feel like you're getting quality time at that point, right? Because part of what diminishes the quality is that person is very conscientious that they're only giving you 37 minutes, and then they're on to their next thing. They're already thinking about their next thing. So so it's inescapable if we want to live in a technological age. It's inescapable if we want to have things like computers and smartphones and trains and postal service. It's inescapable that we would atomize time, but the danger and where I think we really have to that biblical concept of Sabbath, right? the One of the things that you and I've been studying the faith from a Jewish point of view, and one of the things that really has just come crashing into my world as I've studied the Bible from a Jewish worldview is that Sabbath is the heart of all biblical spirituality.
Hmm.
Uh, just the gift of just unfettered time
Yep.
in which you're not trying to do or accomplish anything. You're simply trying to be in the presence of God, your faith community, your family. Even you're even giving yourself the gift of time. You're just for one whole day. You're not moving from one thing to the next. And
Right.
I think we need that now more than we've ever needed it as a human race.
I'm glad you said that, because the scripture I'm going to read is from Matthew 6:26 through 27. And if you know your Gospels, you know that Matthew is the author to bringing the gospel to the Jewish community. Um, and this says, look at the bird. This is Matthew 6, verse 26 through 27. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? There's this mix of time and concern here, which is where I ultimately land on where, the ultimate problem is not that having time and schedule is a bad thing, but there's a constant concern in our lives of making the next appointment of how much I have to spend here in order to survive or to provide this for myself or for others. And not saying that those things aren't important because, you know, there is a aspect of we do reap what we sow, but there is this idea of God intends us to not be at work 7 days a week because he himself was not at work 7 days a week. And you think about going back to Sabbath, why did God take a Sabbath? He's God. Was he tired? No, he doesn't get tired. Was he out of creative juices? No. I mean, he could create an infinite number of things. He rested to show an example of how valuable that is for us. Um, and I think too much of our world today is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, go, 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 work, work, work. And we forget that value of rest, and we let time consume us to a point where we are honestly slaves to it, rather than using it for the advantage it was created for. Equally, to tell us when we, what our hours are of dedicating ourselves to jobs and performances, but also the time that we have that's freedom, that's ours to rest, to relax, to recreate with those that we love.
Sabbath too reminds us that God is God before He created a thing, right? One of the misnomers that is to say that God is first the creator. No, first, God is Himself. God simply is. That's why He tells Moses, "I am." Before God created anything, God is valuable and of worth just in and of Himself, and then He creates these creatures called humans who bear the image of God, and He tells them by giving them the gift of Sabbath, you are valuable simply for who you are and what you are, completely detached from anything you create or do or produce. You are valuable in and of yourself. There's a time and a place to be creative and productive and energetic and to contribute something. That's also part of what it is to be human. But the essence of being human isn't sort of justified by the ability to produce and create and make things happen. The value is intrinsic value, and I think when we practice Sabbath, when we go on a vacation with our kids and we stop for that week returning emails and text messages and put down the phone and have days of just play and rest, we're telling ourselves, but we're also telling our family, you're valuable. You're valuable enough for me to unplug from everything else and focus on you for a week, and for us to just be together, and that itself is a valuable thing to do. That you're not sort of cheating the system during that week, or doing something less important. You're doing something that's immensely important, every bit as important as the normal productive work you're doing during ordinary time.
Yep, 100% agree. I think that's also why it's the command to fellowship, because fellowship is as an element of play, of leisure, and relaxation with those whom
Yeah,
we love in the family of God. I think that's a great place for us
yeah.
to land today, my brother. And so
All right, brother.
we're going to call it a day. And thanks for being with me again
All
today,
right.
as always, Eddie. And man, we'll catch you next
Thanks,
week, and
brother.
we're going to do it again.
Thanks.
Bye bye, everyone.
Once again, we want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today on 2 Feet Deep. If you would like to reach out with any questions or thoughts, please email us at 2feetdeeppodcast@gmail.com. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and we'll see you next time.